Welcome back. This is a deeper look at the irregular verbs where we examine some of the patterns within the full list of irregular verbs, and I give you a full list of all the irregular verbs in English. This is lesson 6 in our lecture series. So in the previous lesson, we discussed how there are two verbs, the verbs be and have, which are, in a sense, super irregular verbs. Most irregular verbs only break the rule for the preterite and past participle forms, but be breaks the rule for the simple and simple third person form, the preterite form, and the past participle form. Whereas have breaks the rule for the simple third person, the preterite, and the past participle. So be breaks the rule in 4 places, have breaks the rule in 3 places. This is what makes these two verbs unusually irregular. And another interesting fact is that these are actually the two most common verbs in the English language. But fortunately, these are the only verbs in English that are that irregular. Every other irregular verb only breaks the rule for the preterite and past participle forms. Now, as we're talking about irregular verbs, and we get to this point in the lesson, my students usually have a question for me. They want to know, how many irregular verbs are there? And the answer I give them is that this depends. For instance, if I give you the irregular verb draw, the bare form is draw, the infinitive form is to draw, the simple form is draw, the simple third person form is draws, the preterite form is drew, the past participle is drawn, and the present participle is drawing. So this is an irregular verb because it does not follow the rule for the preterite form. If it was regular, it would be drawed, but it's drew. Likewise, if it was regular, it would be drawed, but it's drawn for the participle. So this is an irregular verb. But we can also take this root form, this irregular verb, and add some prefixes onto it to make new verbs like redraw or overdraw. Now, redraw and overdraw follow the exact same pattern as draw. The bare form is overdraw, the infinitive form is to overdraw, the simple form is overdraw, the simple third person is overdraws, the preterite is overdrew, the past participle is overdrawn, and the present participle is overdrawing. So, when we count irregular verbs, this is my question. Should we count these really as 3 verbs, 3 separate irregular verbs, or should we count them really as sort of almost like different versions of the same verb? The answer is important because if you count let's say verbs that are that all have the same root. If you count draw, redraw, overdraw as 3 separate verbs, then there are about 600 irregular verbs in English. But if you count them as just one verb, sort of different versions of the verb draw, then English only has about 200 irregular verbs. Now in my class, in order to make my students feel not overwhelmed by the number of irregular verbs, I say that English has about 200 irregular verbs, and I consider these, at least for the purpose of counting irregular verbs, as all different versions of the same verb. There's not really a right or wrong answer, but the way you answer this question determines how many irregular verbs there are. But I am going to say that there are 200 and count these all as sort of one version of the same verb. Different versions of the same verb. All right, now that we've established that there are 200 irregular verbs, let's move on to the next slide and take a look at all of them. So here we go. Here is a PDF that I made a few years back that shows all 200 of these irregular verbs. Let me zoom in on each page, so if you want, you can pause the video and write them down. They're sorted alphabetically, so here's the first page of the irregular verbs. Here is the second page. And here is the third page. Now, just a few things to note. As I mentioned before, I do not if there are different verbs that have basically the same root but different prefixes, I counted them as one verb. This was what we just talked about. If there are archaic irregular verbs that nobody uses anymore, these are verbs like hag ride and wind, dight, or laid, I have not included them in my list because my grammar lessons are focused on modern standard English, modern standard academic English of the kind you would see on something like the SAT. If you read old English literature, you might encounter these verbs, but for our purposes, we're going to ignore them as archaic. Also, there are some verbs where there are both regular forms and irregular forms. But if the regular forms sound more natural or more modern to my ear, I decided to call that verb a regular verb and leave it out. For instance, the verb heave has a preterite conjugation of heaved, but there's also an older way of conjugating it. You can say hove, or you could say clapped versus clapped. Since I think that clapped and hove sound a little bit odd to my modern English speaking ear and my modern English listening ear, I've decided to count these as regular verbs and exclude them from the list. Finally, since I'm an American, if there are ever points where the standards of British English and American English conflict, and American English, for instance, considers a verb regular, but the British have a slightly different conjugation, I went with the American standard because I'm an American. Now let's zoom out and look at something else. So we've got this list here of 200 irregular verbs, and I find that students can sometimes find this a little bit overwhelming. Like, how am I supposed to memorize all of these verbs? And one thing that helps them is that if you study this list, you'll notice that you can actually take these verbs and group them up into patterns. And memorizing them in groups can help you memorize them, I think, a little bit more easily and break down this big job into smaller pieces. So now let me show you some of the interesting groups that have appeared within this irregular verb list. So here are patterns within the irregular verbs. The first group that's worth looking at, and is probably the most famous, is that there is a group of irregular verbs where the past participle always ends with en. These are verbs like arise, arose, arisen, break, broke, broken, speak, spoke, spoken, shake, shook, shaken, weave, wove, woven. So these are the group of irregular verbs where the past participle always ends with an n. Another group that's interesting and relatively large is the group of irregular verbs where the bare form, the preterite form, and the past participle are all the same. Verbs like bet, 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 cut, 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 set, 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 wet, 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 rid, 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 and so on. A third group, which is useful to know about, is this group. It's relatively small. There's only 4 verbs in it, but it is the ear or orn pattern. For instance, bear, bore, born, tear, tore, torn, swear, swore, sworn, wear, wore, worn. A fourth useful group to know about is the group where the participle always ends with own. For instance, blow, blew, blown, throw, threw, thrown, know, knew, known. Another useful group, when you're memorizing the irregular verbs, is the group where the participle ends with an ung or a ung, right? Verbs like cling, clung, clung, sing, sang, sung, ring, rang, rung, swing, swung, swung. For me as an English teacher, I actually have my students memorize the irregular verbs in these little groups because it breaks up this job and makes it more manageable. And I'll give them, for instance, the homework of memorizing one of these groups every week until after, say, a month and a half, they've memorized them all. We go down, there's also the ink, ank, unk group, drink, drank, drunk, sink, sank, sunk. And then there's this, really, there are these two irregular verbs that I noticed are just very, very strange in the way they're conjugated. Eat, ate, eaten, go, went, gone. I mean, look at this. If you did not already know that went and go were actually different forms of the same verb, I don't think you could figure it out. The way this is pronounced and spelled is so different from this that it's one of these things we get used to as English speakers, but don't realize how strange it is until we actually have to look at it in more detail. Finally, I'm going to zoom out and look at the last group. This is a group of irregular verbs where I couldn't really detect any pattern, but I didn't find that they fit into any other group. So this was sort of my miscellaneous catch-all final group of irregular verbs. And there we go. When I get a little bit more tech savvy, I will take these PDFs and I will post them on the same website where you can find this video so that students and English teachers can download this and use it for their own studies. But here we have it. The full list of all the irregular verbs in English with explanations for how I made this list. And then below all of that are some patterns within the irregular verbs that can be useful when you are thinking about how to approach this big task of studying the irregular verbs. Anyway, I hope this video has been useful, and I hope I see you in the next video. All the best.